Excellent singing. Wonderful song. Great message. Who, whose, and what? Who are you? Whose are you? And what are you about? That's what I want to talk about this morning. Now, if I were to come out here and just walk over here to one of our students and say, "What is your name?" And he'd say, "Walter Harrington." And if I went over here to Jessica and I said, "Jessica, I'm not going to call him Walter Harrington anymore. I'm going to call him Charlie Brown." She said the okay. Would that change who he is? Not really. It wouldn't change anything about it. I want to know, who are you this morning? Not, are you a student, or a retired person, or a little child. We want to talk about who you are, whose you are, and then finally, because of those two things, what are you really about? Now think for just a moment, because if you were talking to a bunch of people that were football players, that's about the time for that good old season to come around, and I look forward to that. You go to a high school group, and you say, "What do you do?" You say, "I'm a football player. I belong to this team over here." And you say to this group, "What are you about?" "Being number one. We're going to win." That's what they're about. And so if you were talking to the football player and say, "Well, would you be happy just putting on the uniform and sitting over here on the side?" No. Because there's more to being on a football team than just sitting on the right side, or wearing the right colors, or even cheering about what's going on. But those guys, for instance, that don't start the game out, they're watching every play. They're focused on every movement. And they're waiting for the opportunity for the coach to say, "Johnson, yes sir. You get with Jones and you get Smith. You block, you do it, and you take the ball and you go for that goal." "Yes sir." Because that's what they're after. They're not just satisfied with sitting there. You ask them, who are they? They say, "We're football players." But what are you about? That's a whole different thing to them. So let's think about that this morning. Because how you look at who you are, whose you are, will ultimately determine what we're about as individuals, as Christians, and as a church. Spiritually speaking, who are you? How do you see yourself? And whose are you? What is your connection? Your affinity? I belong to what? I remember being in Argentina. This was 1980. We left to go down there to be missionaries. And it was quite a length of time went by before we finally got around to getting to the point where we could actually register our children with the embassy. So we were there for 3 years. And we've been all over that town. 12 million people live in that town. It's a big city. And we had been there a long time and had been under dictatorships and wars that went on. And we went down to the U.S. Embassy with a piece of paper in hand, all written in Spanish, about the birth of our first daughter. But we were going to get a live birth of an American passport, an American birth certificate. So we go in, and as we're approaching this area, there's this huge building, fortress-like structure. And there in the midst of Argentina flew red, white, and blue. never looked so good. I knew whose I was. I just walked up there, pulled out that U.S. passport and said, I belong here. Come right in. Because not everybody gets to go in. Whose are you? And what are you about? We have here at Central some in our congregation, as has been described, as having been here before they were born. Right, Arch? He was here, his mom was bringing him before he was even out. And others much similar to that. You've been here your entire life. In our congregation, we also have a group of people you could call sojourners. Some of you have been here a few months, and some of you a number of years. Oh, Willis here that led the prayer a while ago, he was a student over here at UTC. You could talk to Chuck Kilpatrick and find out some of the things he used to get into, too. But he's been here a while. Short time, long time. Sojourners. And you're up to doing things. And some of you in the process are still finding out what you're about. Some of you are looking for a place. And some just are here. There's also, I'd say, another group of people here. And next week it's going to grow. This is our UTC group. And next week, coming in, flowing in, will be a large sector. Now, we've got a small group over here. These are our student directors. And I'm thankful for you guys. And this group is going to swell. We're going to have some in here that are going to be brand new, that are just barely out of high school, not a long time ago. And they are leaving home for the first time in their life. And they're out on their own. And probably somewhere in the midst, most of them are going to have parents nearby, worried to death, especially if it's the first child. Also in that group, besides these bunch here, are going to be others that are returning back. That are much closer to graduation time, much closer to taking their place in life of what they're going to be about. Now capture this from my perspective, looking up here out. This is our congregation. And we're going through this process, all of us really, as sojourners in life, in an effort to get to heaven. What we as individuals decide will impact everyone in this auditorium of who you are, of whose you are, and what you're about. This group of college students, just this small group right here, can make a major impact in this area, and vice versa. So I want you to think very solemnly about who you are. Now, as we think about this, let's see what God has to say. How you see yourself should be based upon how God sees you. We can turn to the first pages of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1. We can find in Genesis 1, verse 27, that we are made in God's image. All of God's creation. That is, human beings, of course. Have an image of God, a spark of God inside us. Something that makes us unique from everything else out there. Even the smartest of animals out there have nothing to say about that little difference, which is so major. As far as us as a group in this auditorium, for the most part, we look at ourselves according to what Acts chapter 11 would say in verse 26. The Bible says that that group of people were called Christians first in Antioch. And we take that name. It tells something about who we are. It sets us apart from society. Let's see what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 2. As Peter begins to define very distinguishing marks between the world out there and actually who we are. He says in chapter 2, verse 9, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation." Now the Jewish people for a long time had felt much about that, being chosen people. But he'll go on later and he'll talk about the whole group of Christians being a royal priesthood to God. And so they're totally distinct even from what the Jewish race was now. He says, this is who you are. I want to define who you are, Peter says. I want you to get this image in your mind. Because I want you to see yourself totally apart from the rest of the world. That you don't start mixing yourself up and getting confused as you're out there doing what you normally do in the world in survival. In working or doing or planning or shopping or anything like this. Because you're different. So get a good, clear definition of who you are. When you walk in these doors. And when you go out. And wherever you go. That you put on the mindset. That you see yourself. That maybe there's a logo on the mirror that says, I am, before you head out the door, a holy nation of God. I am a Christian. I define myself this way. Now, it was so good for me when I walked up toward that American embassy in Argentina after living under a dictatorship and having gone through war situations there and not being very well liked. Because the war was between England and the U.S. and they knew what they saw in us, speaking English. But I walked up there and I was ready to lay that passport. Who I was defined me. It made me distinct from everybody else that stood in line hoping to get in and maybe someday get a form of immigration filled out. Who are you? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says there in one little portion of a phrase in verse 10, he says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. You know, Paul, he wasn't raised a Christian like many of you. Matter of fact, had it not been for the blinding light on the road to Damascus, Paul would have been in Damascus putting people in prison and killing them just like he did back in Jerusalem. By the grace of God, we are. Now you think about this whole composite of who you are. Or even just pause for a moment. Let's put yourself in an airplane flying to Afghanistan. And when you get off the plane, they take away everything that belongs to you. They wrap you in a turban and all this local wear that they have on there. And they say, give me your passport. You know why, Lord? I'm not giving this up. I am an American. And I want to hold on to that, especially in a setting like that. Now think about what Peter's defined here. We've read here about who you are as a Christian. And all of the characteristics that describe you. Would you give that up? What would you sell it for? All right, who you are. Number two, whose you are. As Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and they were having a little problem distinguishing themselves from the rest of the Corinthian people that were so immoral, so out of place, so out of whack, so focused on everything out there. It was a New York City 10 times worse. Talking about Port City and sailors coming in and out. I mean, everything you can imagine going on in Corinth was going on there, and much more. And Paul said, you are not your own. You are bought with a price, 1 Corinthians 6. He wanted them to see now that they're not part of what they used to be. You belong in a different city now. You belong to Jesus Christ. This is whose you are. You don't belong to yourself. You know, they had the sayings like a lot of times we have in our day and time. I'm from Corinth. I can do as I please. I can live the way I want. And that's the kind of thing they had. Paul said, not anymore. You're not your own. I want you to remember whose you are, as well as who you are. John chapter 6, massive crowd of people were following Jesus. The goal of any preacher out there to think they could impact that many people. And Jesus began to talk about words that were rather tough for them. And after a while, they began to be disgruntled. And he said, do these hard sayings bother you? And then he just bared down even more on them. And then finally it said that they left. The whole multitudes left, walked away, John 6. And then Jesus turns to his apostles, and he looked at them, and he's wanting to know if they know who they belong to or not. And he said, do you want to go away too? This is the time. Doors open. And their response in verse 68 is, to whom shall we go? You have the words of life. See, they had a focus on whose they were. They would not leave Jesus' side. That would bear a big difference in what they were about when they were set on the world with that mission. But right then they were defining whose they were. And they weren't going to leave no matter how tough the sayings got from Jesus. Because they knew who they belonged to. And oh, the world gets tough out there. It'll get tough in school. It'll get tough in the community. Satan will bear down on your family. He'll do anything he can do. And we just got to hang in there with that mindset of whose we are. Where else are we going to go? There is no place else that we can even think about turning to. God, help us to think about giving up on things like that. Paul writes in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, but not I, but Christ lives in me. His whole life is redefined now by whose he is. It's not me anymore now. I belong to somebody else. Go back to what Peter was writing about, 1 Peter chapter 2, as he was talking about the royal priesthood, the chosen generation. And then he says, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his marvelous light. You were once not a people, but now you are a people of God. Whose we are. God's own people. Now, to be able to figure out what we're about, we have to see clearly who we really are. And we're going to have to define that daily, because Satan is out there trying to change our mind in that. Paul says you get back there and you keep transforming your mind, renewing your mind. So this who we are, the world's trying to redo every day, trying to tell us things about our nation. You hear people saying that we are not, and we stand up and say, I'm not that. Even more so as a Christian. You stand on your tippy toes as much as you can. I am this way. This is who I am. And this is who I belong to. And we get that clear picture of that, then we can understand what we are truly about. Get an overall view. So what we are about is more than just a group of people that gather together on Sunday morning to worship. More than a group of people that on every third Sunday we go down that ramp and we go to the fellowship room and we have food. And the ladies fix this great meal. And more than just sharing food and things and belongings to the people in the community. More than that. What we are about is so much higher than those things. And although worship is important. And fellowship is important. And sharing our belongings and reaching out and extending ourselves in the community and the world is so important. But we're so much more above that. Being here is part of what we do, but it's not what we are about. We're not a group of people that just gathers together a certain day of the week. But we have so much more. Here's what Paul says. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Now he's going to go back and he's going to write about himself at the end of his life. But what he's telling you about is what he was about all the way through that brought him to this point. Getting toward the end, he says in verse 6 of chapter 4, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering." In other words, body's about ready to end here. He's been in jail, and it looks like this is execution coming up. That's the way I see this. The time of my departure is at hand. But he's not at an airport. But he knows he's departing this world. Now, what got him to that point? He said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." Finally, some translations say, "Henceforth," or "therefore, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness." You see, what I have been about are these things right here.